we will make it work. So, I'm Meredith Preston-McGhie. I'm the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism. Welcome to this panel. Gosh, thanks, guys. I'm just going to start by very briefly welcoming and introducing the panel, say a word or two, and then we're going to dive straight in. Toni Mello from TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University, repping Ontario here on the panel. Aleem Bharwani from the University of Calgary, Tim Rahilly from Mount Royal University. So again, welcome to the three of you. I think this is going to be a great discussion about where university campuses are at in this discussion. I kind of wanted to reframe the title in reference to Ian Williams' talk, which I just thought was so incredibly thoughtful. And this idea of spaces to become acquainted with the real and become acquainted with the real that's different and not homophily, which is my new word for the day. Thank you, Zara. But how do we become acquainted with the real and different and build those kind of democratic muscles? We've been talking a lot today, I think, about some of the enablers within our system that allow us and help us to do that, from public libraries to public education to civic organizations and sports clubs. And university and college campuses, I think, are really at the heart of that. But it has not been easy. It's been a tough few years, to say the least. So we wanted to start with a Mentimeter question, if our fearless organizers can put the Mentimeter up. Do we have it? Yes. Oh, no, uh-oh. And so the question that we're asking you to comment on is, do you feel that university and colleges are adequately preparing students for democratic participation and not just for employment? And if some of you feel like they're not even equipping them for employment, that's for another panel, that's for another discussion. But are universities and colleges adequately preparing students for democratic civic participation? Wow. Do you guys just want to go?
I want to hear what people think after they have a cookie.
Yeah, maybe this was the wrong timing for this panel because everybody's just hangry. But we wanted to ask this question and then actually ask our panelists to really kick off on this specific question of our universities. And I'm going to switch from universities and colleges. I'm just going to talk about universities because these are just universities that are represented up here. Are universities doing enough to prepare students for democratic participation? I think we all feel that this is an imperfect moment, to say the least. But where do you feel you are? Maybe what's holding it back? And Toni, I'm going to start with you.
So not an easy question and difficult to see even what the room feels. And one of the reasons for which I work in the university context is I believe these are campuses that are at the heart of the major global issues and human rights issues that face our time, right? Students are at the forefront of many movements. You've seen the scholarly research up on this stage that comes from the research project that is at the center of universities' reason for being. And then we are faced with real challenges of the polarization we've been hearing about today, of government funding that has changed dramatically, increases in tuition and costs, the shifting of universities to try to get funding for the educational project that I think makes it even harder for us to meet some of the mandates that I think we all hold as aspirational. And I think one of the critical places where there is an intersection that we need to think about is the question of, is the role of a university or college to prepare students to be critical thinkers, active participants, contributors to their communities, or is it to prepare them for job readiness? And increasingly, as you see this funding crunch and a shift in what sort of the world is demanding of people, there has been a demand on universities to help to get students more ready for the workforce. And for a long time, I critiqued this. I saw it as a betrayal of the heart of our project. It's for workforces to get them ready for that specific field. It's for us to make them critical thinkers. And as I watch the realities that my students face in urban realities and rural realities, where they need to make ends meet, they need to feed their families, they need to think about their future, I think it's important for it to not be an either or, and for us to recognize these things aren't mutually exclusive. You can have civic readiness and job readiness intersect hand in hand, right? And if I look in the business world, my doctoral research looks at businesses. And if I look at the business world and think about the skills that are most needed for some of our folks in business, they are these humane skills and critical thinking skills that universities are slated to teach. How to be a robust and critical thinker, how to demonstrate empathy, how to build relationships. We've heard about that this entire morning. It's both important and essential as well as strategic to build those relationships. How do you work across cultures and across difference? How do you resolve conflict? These are skills that you need in the job market and that you need for civic action. And so I think part of what we've tried to do at TMU is think about ways we can do both, that we can embed these values into the ways in which we're educating and training our students so that they bring it into wherever they go. And not just their work life, but into their communities and into their families and dinner tables. I think the second thing I thought about that's so important as somebody, I'm the vice president of equity at my university. And so thinking about both how the tide has shifted around this topic, both in terms of commitments in the US and Canada, as well as how we're even talking about it, right? I think of the importance of the elements that we hold as most central to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Those elements of sense of belonging, of dignity of the human person, of the importance of somebody for who they are outside of what they do or contribute, right? But just that they exist and they have value and they should be treated with dignity. And how all of those feel like things that we have to defend fiercely. And I realized in COVID that one of the things that happened was we all shifted immediately to emergency response, where everyone was checking in on their neighbors and dropping off banana bread. I benefited greatly from that. To once you knew the emergency was going to be sustained, people shifted into self-preservation. And I feel like we've been living in this state of emergency, which seems to be worsening. COVID has lessened, but now we have global threat, we have war across the globe, climate change. There's a sense of emergency that we are seeing in our students where they feel like, I got to take care of me, and I got to take care of my immediate community, and I don't care about anybody else. And I'll say this one last thing before I pass it on. Where we see our role is, how do we engage those young people to think about their role as civic actors, to think about them having a responsibility to both care about your family and drop off banana bread and know the numbers of 3 people in your community. I think that sense of connection has to happen at the university context, both in person, as we've been talking about, and online, and finding different ways for people to engage and to be thought of. And I think at the heart of the project, what we're starting to look at now is, how do we train our students and our community members to think about the responsibility they have, no matter what field they go into, to serve the broader public in that action. And that's something I think we need to think about differently. As I hear over and over from students, I can't even afford the basic things that my parents said they could, so I have to do everything to take care of myself. How do we get them committed to civic action in their professions so they think about that obligation of service as part of the product that they're bringing?
Thanks, Toni. Great way to kick us off. Aleem?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what you said. And
this is going to be great.
It's not a disagreement. That wasn't the setup for a disagreement. No, I do agree with a lot of what you said. And I think the proof is in the pudding. And I think COVID showed where we have perhaps failed our ability to create professionals capable of functioning in a high conflict setting, and our ability to actually set the table for a dialogue. And I think there's 3 specific COVID type examples. One is COVID spread by droplet or aerosol? And you had aerosol engineers who thought the public health people were idiots, and you had the public health people who thought aerosol engineers were idiots. And in reality, in the end, it seems like it's probably a mixed spread with both aerosol and droplet. Two, you had in Calgary in the Northeast some of the lowest vaccination rates in the country until the public health agencies started to engage with civil society in those areas, and then suddenly it became one of the highest rates of public vaccination in the country. Three, urban and rural differences, which has bred a lot of resentment that's persisted to today, that the way a farming community needs to engage and protect themselves from COVID when you have 3 people living on one farm and a very large distance from the next farm is going to be different than how you're going to need to protect people who live in a condo with several hundred people in one building sharing elevators and stairwells and everything else. So I think as a university, did we train our professionals to be able to engage as policymakers, as decision makers, as engineers, as healthcare professionals, to be able to understand difference, to be able to find creative ways forward, to be able to understand and have that grounded in a strong sense of understanding? And did the university actually create the tables, the environments to have those conversations that are constructive, productive, and creative, no matter what those differences are? And I don't think we did a good job in any of those aspects.
Excellent. Tim?
Wow. Tough to go after these two. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here, and welcome to Calgary for those of you who are visiting. I'm slightly depressed looking at the response to the Mentimeter, but I think there's a couple of different ways to interpret this. I think I'd start off from my perspective, kind of asking you to reflect on what your understanding of what a university is. And I think one of the challenges that we do have, and this is not an Alberta thing, I think this is a North American thing, is trying to figure out what the role of a university is. If I look at some of our establishing documents, things that are always exciting to read, like the Post-Secondary Learning Act of Alberta, it does not actually, it tells us how to do things, it really doesn't tell us what we're doing, which maybe is a gift when I think about it, especially in the current times. But I think I would differentiate between kind of what we are doing in terms of dissemination of knowledge, knowledge creation, and look at how we do some of these things. Because I think we often look at universities as microcosms, and I think that in some ways we get that right. As I say that, I do know, I have seen some of the research that has been done, for instance, by Abacus Data, that has looked at the eroding public trust of institutions, and especially during COVID, and you're making me hungry talking about cookies and banana bread, but we did see during COVID a bit of a dip in public trust. Now, universities are still among the leading institutions in terms of public trust, but and apparently we're building back up a bit, which I think is super heartening. But I think more and more people are looking at us in terms of what we're teaching as opposed to how we're teaching it. People want to weigh in on the political leanings of people, or somehow they want access to our students. They want to be able to come in the front door and make sure that students are exposed to a particular way of thinking, which I think is somewhat concerning. So I think that, we expect disagreement within the university, and I think we are trying to help people understand how to disagree with each other. And a couple words that I heard which I think really resonate for me are things like belonging. And I think we want that in greater society, and within universities we do have that opportunity to create that sense of belonging, so that people care about each other, they go forward when they leave the institution, and they kind of replicate that in their ongoing lives. I think we've got some cards kind of stacked against us. Toni mentioned a few of them in terms of who's coming, the financial conditions, expectations that we're going to get people jobs. And of course, I mean, I think most people go to university, they expect to be employable when they finish some university studies. I don't think that that makes perfect sense to me. I think I was the same way when I was a student. But I do think we have an opportunity for civic engagement. I think we have an opportunity to do a lot more. I guess there's more we could do. But I do sometimes feel like the cards are stacked against us, because more and more students are part-time. More and more the students are coming from financially, they have some difficulties. So we've got to figure this out. and how to engage these folks, even though they are coming with different expectations and different assets.
I wanted to ask all of you to think a little bit about kind of what is one of the big democratic challenges that universities need to help prepare students to respond to, and what's holding you back from doing that. But I want to tweak the question a little bit, because I do want to zero in a little bit on this question of belonging, but also bring it into the skills that it takes to build a society where, and I think Niamh put it really beautifully this morning, we belong to each other. I don't belong at the expense of you, you don't belong at the expense of me, we belong to each other because we are in this together. But to be able to do that, we have to disagree with one another and still see each other as human. And that is, for me, I've been hearing this over and over again all day, that is the fundamental question for me. And I know that the challenge of how you disagree and disagree with respect has been a really tough thing for universities in the last few years. I'm conscious, given we're following the digital public square conversation as well, that the bots are telling us we can live a frictionless existence, and we can't, which also means that you have young people coming in who maybe are less accustomed to some of the friction that you're asking of people to disagree well. And so I wanted each of you to maybe just reflect a little bit on what is holding back universities from being able to help prepare that kind of disagreement, or where do you see your ability to really lean in on helping young people build that muscle? Tim, I might drop this back to you first.
Okay, I get to go first. That's exciting. So I think where I would focus in on is something to do with truth. So I think, and in some ways it's so tempting to say, what is truth? And I can answer that question. Universities are full of really smart people, and they can often answer questions. But I think where we can make a difference and where we can lean in is actually talk about how would we know something is true? What are the questions that we would ask? What is the evidence that we would look for so that our graduates are able to participate and kind of have part of that dialogue? I look back to, and I don't know, I wasn't thinking about COVID before we came on the panel, but the conversation has come to COVID, and I recall, having a conversation with a student, actually, and the student was super keen on debating me. The student believed very strongly, you'll like this as a physician, in ivermectin. So we had all these, masking mandates, and in Alberta, we weren't allowed to require vaccines, but we were required, we could ask for people to check in a couple weeks in terms of COVID tests. And so if you had been vaccinated, you could get an exemption from COVID testing. So that's how we did it in Alberta, believe it or not. And so this student wanted to have a public debate about ivermectin, and I said, no, thank you. The student was quite shocked that I wouldn't take him up on this opportunity to expose the truth. And I said, I'm a psychologist, you're an undergraduate student in your first year, I don't know how far we're going to get on ivermectin, how would we be able to answer that question? And, he was a nice kid. Sorry, that sounds very kind of not nice, but he was a decent young fellow, and he kind of was like, oh, like that's really interesting. I've never thought about how we might answer that question. I just have this belief in ivermectin. And so anyway, all this to say, it's just kind of a case in point of how I think we can help people as they hear so many things. And we have facts, and was it Kellyanne Conway in the US who said we have alternative facts? And so I think that's where we can make a difference.
Thanks, Tim. I know Aleem and Toni have both thought a lot about this, so I'm going to go back down the line on this question of how do you help people disagree.
So first, I think this is the value of having a psychologist in a position of leadership. Like, I think understanding the psyche, understanding like the real nature of how people think and feel, and being able to navigate that with a leader lens is, I think, a really important leader skill that I think is often lacking in institutional leaders. And that's part of how we filter for who takes on leadership roles in universities. Just because you have the most number of publications or millions in grants doesn't mean you actually have some of the fundamental humanistic skills required to understand someone different than yourself, and to do that at scale, and to create the infrastructure to allow us to do that at scale. And so I think our institutions are built for a time well long past, and perhaps not even as well built for back then, but at least the issues weren't sort of bubbling, or not at least, the issues weren't just bubbling up the way they are now. And so I think their governance structures, our filtered model of developing leaders, and even where we choose to invest resources. I think there is an abundance of resources in our public systems. The question is, how are we choosing to deploy those resources, and what are we choosing not to deploy them to do? And I think there's a fundamental issue of polarization from some of the work I've done is everyone's top 3 priority, but it's no one's number 1 priority. And so what you end up having is all these different special interest groups or special interest considerations in like the most sort of small SI, definition of that possible, is you'll always just feed whatever is people's individual or small group number 1 priority. And in the end, the public good functions end up falling off. And so I think all of these things just contribute to an institutional inertia to just not do things differently. And then to try and interrupt that cycle becomes very challenging, because it requires governance transformations, leadership reimaginations, investment reallocations, and a reconsideration of how we set priorities and what priorities are actually going to be actioned.
And the purpose of universities to do all this in the first place. Toni?
So I think to talk about the university as a vacuum without talking about the external forces is also limiting, right? I remember when, I'm a human rights lawyer, and I had a trans student come into my office, and she said, I deal with transphobia on the subway, I deal with it in my own family, I deal with it at the Eaton Center, I don't want to deal with it at university. As if our university is a bubble where we can prevent all of the racism, homophobia, sexual violence that is happening out there from coming in. So what we can do is train the next generation, increase awareness, do work in different ways so that we transform our young people into leaders. But to assume that we are not affected as a university community by what's happening outside, I think limits our solutions. And so we can train our students all, as much as I want, on how to speak with respect and dignity. But when their professors are responding in ways that I don't think show respect or dignity, and I can't train their professors because of certain protections they have, then I have a different problem. If our professors and our staff are behaving in ways that I think live up to those ideals, but the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of our country aren't, then what are the messages that they're getting about what success is? So I think part of what we need to do is think about the ways we do this work on large scales and small scales to change that narrative of what success is, right? And we haven't talked a lot about capitalism today, and I don't have enough time to start, but I think some of the challenges we have are very strictly related to the growing inequality that has resulted in an abuse of power that we're seeing from a very few elite at the hands of many, right? And an abuse of that power that makes you start to believe, I better be in that elite or I'm out here and have relatively no power, no money, no access. And so I see more and more people picking options that I think are a response to what they're seeing externally as forces of success. The way we've responded is to say we cannot counter every external force, everything they're seeing on TV, on social media, even members of our community that may behave in these ways. But we're going to do the work in various ways. Some of it is big splash ways, programs, panels, things like this exchange being at TMU. Those are the big ways. And some of it is smaller ways, quieter ways. I think there is a notion and a belief that now, if you're not standing up and yelling and at the front of the protest line or making sure that the policy is changed at any cost, then you're serving nothing. And so it becomes this all or nothing binary. And unfortunately, many students who don't want to do the all end up doing nothing. So we talk about what does it mean to think about the different ways that you can balance some of these external forces, realities of needing a job, and having to worry about what you put on social media. For me, working internally and having views that I have to be measured about how I share those views publicly because I represent an institution when I'm here today, right? Thinking about those compromises not as you're a sellout, you're valueless, you've done nothing, but what are the different and quieter ways that we can also affect change, right? So embedding Indigenous ways of learning and doing in our curriculum slowly versus by mandate or by dictate, right? How does that slowly change the way our students engage with Indigenous ways of learning and doing? Deciding that what we're going to start doing is training student mediators. In March, we trained in a program for 3 days, 27 student mediators on our campus, right? We certified them in the hopes that they can start engaging in small little mediations between students when there are disputes. And now we've started in June to train staff that's interested. In the fall, we're going to start training faculty. How do you listen more carefully? How do you repair when you've had a disagreement, right? If I tell my students this, they're like, there's 40,000 of us, we need you on the streets, you're doing nothing, 25 people, what are they gonna do? It's one weekend. And it becomes because we didn't do everything, we're doing nothing. So I think part of our answer has to be, what are the varied responses and what are some of the quiet, not set your hair on fire and have the provincial government come for you, but do the work in effective ways. And what's been hardest for us is to try to do this work and be called sellouts by the very people you're trying to serve.
Sure.
Right? It's been one of the most painful things, and I think Tim will add to that. But the answer is, and it lies in you do the small work, and over time, folks will tell you, okay, that had value, that had meaning. But sometimes in the heart of that crisis or in the heart of trauma and pain that people are legitimately feeling right now, they can't see those quiet acts as part of the transformation.
May I build on that? Yeah, I used to have a whole full head of hair, but I did set it on fire.
It's Alberta.
Well, and even when I was in BC or in Quebec, my God, you know, like I think you're speaking to that environment that we all very much feel across the sector. Now, I'm not here, you know, to say cry us a river, pour us. I think it's an opportunity for us to have this dialogue and recognize some of the challenges. What I love about some of what you said, Toni, is this notion of doing this work with these students. Yeah. And I think we're under tremendous pressure not to do it with them, but do it to them. You know, these are humans, not widgets. You know, yes, we need workers in Fort McMurray. I get it, you know, but we're not in a draft here. You know, like we have to have people have free will. And I think when we talk about these complex issues, we have to recognize the variety of the humans that find their way to these post-secondary institutions. Some people just walk in the door. Others crawl their way there. And also there are huge differences. You know, we're trying to have these conversations and live this with people who have profound interest in different areas. If you're talking to someone who is destined for a healthcare profession, you know, you're talking about a midwife or a nurse, in our case, or a pilot. We do aviation, you know, or someone who's going to study business. We have to have a form of the conversation or conversations with these people. If they're, you know, studying policy studies or political science or economics, we've got to figure out how to inculcate a lot of this stuff into the curriculum, into the hallways, and into the values. And I think that's where I come back to this belonging and connection piece.
And this question of culture, I think, is really critical. And I wanted to pick up on a couple of pieces on this. And Toni, I think you're absolutely right that universities aren't bubbles. They're part of the ecosystem that all of you represent in all of your spaces as well, right? And that they all bleed in and out of one another, and they're all impacted by one another. But also this idea that it doesn't happen by mandate or fiat. And as you were saying that, I was thinking actually about Syria. Stay with me. When President al-Shara took over and HTS came into Damascus and they had the big transformation, there's a fantastic book that's been written called Transformed by the People. And it was two researchers that spent the last 5 years researching HTS. And they looked at how the movement had been culturally changed by having to govern Idlib. And it didn't change by fiat or mandate. It changed by governing a diverse community of people. And it's a really interesting look at, rather than a direction down to change something, how the people shifted and transformed. So they say, time will tell, the culture and leadership systems in HTS to lead them to where they are now in Syria. which is one of the things that does give me a glimmer of hope for Syria's reconstruction. But the reason I say this is I think about something, Aleem, that your provost, Sandra Davidson, has said to me about some of the work that you're doing around pluralism on the University of Calgary campus. And she said that she wanted these ideas of belonging, of disagreeing with respect, of pluralism, to be like, those of you who grew up in the 70s like I do will remember these. Remember those beaded curtains people used to have in their houses? Oh, yeah. That you would walk through this curtain of those values of pluralism, of belonging. You wouldn't divide them. You would just have them wash over you as you walked into the campus, and that was part of how you were inculcating this campus culture. So I'd love for you to just reflect a little bit on some of those aspirations of the Pluralism Initiative and where you're seeing your lessons of trying to impact that campus culture.
Yeah, and I think we can't separate ourselves from the communities around us. And so I think one of the most important things is what are the governance structures, the actual models, the structures, the processes that allow us to recognize the vast array of differences in our midst. And I think when you ask people what does diversity mean, they often think about race and gender and maybe religion, and then it just sort of falls off. But it's so much more than that. It's also our geography, our ideology, our sector, our discipline. It's every semblance of what makes us different from somebody else. So it's first even understanding that there is this wide spectrum of difference, and then making sure all those different voices and the intersectional voices across those have a place to be able to enter into the governance conversations. And so I think Zahra talked about getting rid of the effing dumpster. I think the idea is how through these models of governance can we actually respond to community priorities. And some of them are removing problems, and some of them are creating and responding to ideas to create aspirational futures. And they're both. And so the governance model that we've implemented in the Faculty of Medicine, it takes a relational approach that helps us first understand differences one-to-one, but then also across, so that there's a recognition of those differences and understanding of those differences, and then our ability to co-create new ways forward arising from those differences. So it actually ends up being co-creative, constructive, productive, healthy. It doesn't shy away from difference. It doesn't shy away from things we disagree with. It allows them to sit in front of us all, and in doing so, not shy away. And not, as I know I've heard you say, take agreement off the table just momentarily. Let's just take the need for agreement off the table so we can at least have a conversation. So these are examples of the role governance plays just to reset, turn the kaleidoscope on the entire model in which we reside. And then educationally, how do we create the training environment? So we're also doing facilitation training so that we can, students, staff, and faculty, host difference at scale. So at an individual level, one-to-one, in your small groups, in your classrooms, but also at the macro levels of institutional governance. And to be able to do that then, with every one of those acts in which every one of the participants who joins, you have one more strand with one more bead in that curtain that we can all begin to walk through, because it's not just one at the entrance. Every door and every hallway will have its own, metaphoric set of stringed beads that we will all need to walk through.
It's a long process. I'm going to hand it to you, Toni, but I'm also going to ask the organizers to put the Mentimeter back up, because I'm also conscious that only 71 of 224 people have responded, and that is poor democratic engagement, people.
It's the cookie factor. They were distracted.
And I'm going to say vote yes, not in the separatism sense. Vote yes on this one. I'm campaigning for universities.
The referendum
we
on
can
universities. Do it. Toni.
I just want to add, I'm really moved by the work on pluralism that's being done by Aleem's team, and we're seeing it across Ontario, across the country. And I think we need to continually, when we talk about pluralism, not just talk about difference, but also talk about power. And so I love the systemic approach, because it looks at the systems of power that are very definitive in how pluralistic systems work. And I grew up in a Canada that everyone loved samosas and pierogies, and we were this wonderful multicultural space, but we never talked about inequality, disproportionate negative treatment of certain populations, specifically Black and Indigenous, right? That there was a way that I knew that being Canadian meant being polite and being nice, but not necessarily being truly kind and authentic. right? And so if we talk about pluralism without talking about equity, without talking about power, what you have is difference and people talking about ways in which we can tackle these ideas without talking about who's heard in the room, who's never in the room, who speaks the most, who speaks the least, but everyone's taking notes when they speak, right? And so understanding that has been, for me, the most important part of our educational journey. And where I've learned it best is from our students, who consistently point out inequality in power and point out systemic failure. So I started a program at University of Toronto many years ago, and I was so proud of it. And I was sharing it with a bunch of students. And a student said, "That's a really cute program." And I was like, "I think it's transformative. You're welcome." And they said, "You know what you're doing? It's like a better meal in the residential school, you know, in the cafeteria. So you got us a better meal, but you haven't changed the residential school." And so I'm constantly reminding myself that as we talk about how do we live together in difference, that if we do not acknowledge the power at our dinner tables of who in our family has a voice and who in our family has to defer, then what you start to have is more and more discussion, but the same halls and outcomes that are derived by that power and inequity.
Thanks for that, Toni, because I think that also gets to this point that when we have the tough conversations, we have to have the real conversations. And I am forever reminded of in Ian Williams' Massey lecture, the notion of the said, the unsaid, and the unsayable, and those different layers of what you're really talking about in those spaces. And so, Tim, I wanted to just turn to you about leadership as president of a university. Are university leaders equipped in this moment to lean into these kinds of incredibly tough conversations? And if not, what do you need? Like, what is needed to equip leaders to be able to lead in these kinds of conversations in these moments? Because we do need it to happen.
Yeah, so when we talk about real conversations, that's a good conversation starter on that topic. I think where my mind goes, not to dodge, but I would start off by saying, if not us, who? Because I think we do find ourselves in these positions. Now, I think there's been a lot of change in leadership in post-secondary education over the last 10, 15 years, you know, a new generation. I think it's slow to come, but there is more diversity. I think we are seeing different disciplinary backgrounds, different paths to leadership in universities, myself included. And so, I mean, I think that it is we're human at the end of the day. And so we are skill building. I think that post-secondary leaders in Canada have excelled in acknowledging issues of inequality. I think they have made some inroads into these things, but in terms of actually figuring out what to do about them, it is more challenging. And the expectations are super high. And keeping in mind that everyone in an institution, and you know, you're both at massive institutions, you know, even Mount Royal people think is small, but it's a campus community of 20,000. And so I think the thing there for leaders, very challenging because the numbers are against you, is that notion of, you know, do I see you, do you see me? I am a human. And I think people make a lot of assumptions about leaders, and sometimes in our public persona we can kind of demystify some of those. I think even in the challenging conversations, Toni, that you've just outlined, I think there is a dynamic sometimes. I would make an argument, it's not going to be popular, that anyone on a university campus is privileged in some way or shape. You know, yes, there's all kinds of people in the continuum, but if you're on a university campus, chances are you're doing better than most of the world. And so I think when we're doing this work, including, and this might seem rich coming from, you know, a white guy, but including with various people when we're dealing with issues around indigenization, decolonization, anti-Black racism, et cetera, we often in these conversations, as an example, will have people think that they are somehow held safe from that dialogue because of their own identity. And I think the work we want to do is to actually put both feet in and say all of us have to put our identity in there and have that, right? I mean, are we done with gender equity in this country? You know, I don't think we need a Mentimeter. Yeah, but, you know, I think, you know, we're squeezed in a way where we have to figure out how to do that work. So I'm not exactly answering your question. but I do keep some optimism that that we can do this work. I think we've done an awful lot. I think sometimes people look at it glass half empty, but I would argue we've done a lot, and we need to continue on that trajectory.
Something that has been interesting to me in some of the work that we've done with various university leaders is you often as a leader feel like you have to also be a little bit of everything to everyone.
Yeah, sure.
And I think that there is space, and I wanted to tip it back a little bit for each of you as we start to come to the close of initiatives that are working and things that you're seeing. So I think it's always really important to end on that sort of, these are some of the things that are happening and working. But is that leaders you don't have to be the dialogue facilitator, but you need to know where the dialogue facilitators are on your campus and make sure that you're leaning into utilizing your power to ensure that they're able to do work when it needs to be done or engage with different other experts that are in your space. I mean, you're a psychologist, so obviously you understand how to psychoanalyze all of these problems. But I think that space, that piece of leadership of enabling some of the initiatives that are happening within the university spaces is something that, if I'm really frank, I don't see enough. I'm really amazed at how many interesting initiatives and incredible capacities exist in universities when you kind of force map them, but then you don't see them being utilized as much as maybe they could be. But I think a lot of them are there and are incredible. And so I think in the last little round, I wanted to maybe ask each of you to reflect a little bit on initiatives that you're seeing that are helping you to have these tough conversations, helping you to skill build faculty, staff, leaders, and students, because you're all part of that campus community. Toni, can I start with you?
So I think you're right. And I think it's hard to do when you're fighting so hard to keep the lights on, to think about all of the different transformative work when we're thinking about people in seats and facilities and classroom sizes. When you are so strained by funding and pressure, it's difficult sometimes to think outside of the core curriculum. And I hear that from every administrator, and I still see so many good things happening. So I think using not just Unusual Allies, but the partners doing this work, everything from Samara to the Global Center for Pluralism to, we've been working a lot with community networks, St. Stephen's Community Mediation Hub coming in to train our students, right? Alembic. Thinking of ways we can bring in that expertise when we don't have it, because collegial governance is incredible. You have professors leading a university that have extraordinary skills and sometimes need some of the skills that come from external organizations. We are also doing, I think, a better job at universities of working together, where we look at what each other is doing, and when we see the work on pluralism that's happening in Alberta, we think, okay, can we adopt that here? York University has had a program called Bridging the Gap for many years to get students talking about Israel and Palestine and talking in ways where they can hear each other. And there's facilitation and trauma work and care for how that's done, right? So we're looking at, is that something we could bring here, and what would it look like and what do we need to put into place? If I can talk about one specific thing that's happened at our university in response to the attacks on October 7th and then the ensuing conflict, war, and what has been devastating loss of life in that region that continues and is horrific. Our campus community has been affected and impacted by that in a way that I have never seen in my entire career working in universities and colleges. And we created something called the Community Building Working Group to have frontline staff and faculty come together to think of how do we're not a foreign affairs department and we can't respond to everything that's happening as a result, but how do we think about the people that are impacted in our community? And we focused on three things. The first was just healing, that not everybody was ready to talk, that we need everything from more meditation classes to counseling, to specific counseling. We had a session called Navigating Jewish Grief, run by a Jewish counselor. We had an imam come in and do counseling for Muslim students who wanted spiritual counseling. So how do you think of what healing means? We had indigenous beading, coloring, things that at first people really were frustrated by, because they were like, there's a conflict and you're coloring? And then we had others say, no, we need different ways to heal, to come together, to be quiet, right? To be in our pain. Then the second tranche was thinking about how do we actually bring our community back together again? We can't even get folks on campus. How do we take them to exhibits? How do we bring them together for panels? How do we bring them together for lunches? And we spent a year doing events that would bring them together and talk about some of these topics. And then the last was, how do we do education? Everything from having organizations come in to train on Islamophobia, on anti-Semitism, on conflict, on repair, thinking about that. And so it's been an initiative that started with tons of external partners that we've worked with, and over time has proved to have some real results. But I think part of it is saying we're going to do that work, and for this, it's work in a quieter way that has many prongs so you can engage in the place that you are.
I love that. Thanks, Toni. Aleem.
So I think there are many great examples in higher ed, and I think TMU is a great example, SFU's WA Center is a great example. There are many, many great examples at scale, but then also in terms of individual specific classrooms. Like there's a prof in our institution whose name is Safana, and she really leads with empathetic pedagogy. And so there's sort of all sorts of really phenomenal work at scale. There's an uncountable number of examples. I think there's also many examples of people who are doing this work outside of universities. Who bring together universities. When we started hosting third spaces to talk about the Middle Eastern geopolitical issues and how those are landing on campuses, I think that's one example. So the role of the GCP in helping facilitate. I also think that there are many, almost all the groups that have presented at this conference today are all examples of people and organizations who bring a lot of capacity and expertise that I think we can then begin to translate over and sort of adopt into different spaces. So I think there's sort of an endless number of really great examples all around, and I think it's creating those convening opportunities to be able to actually learn and actually explicitly adapt into different contexts.
Excellent. Tim, I'm going to give you the last word.
That's always scary. I'll point to just maybe two flavors of things. I think sometimes there are some things you can do that might seem minor but are still nice. And so one thing I'd just like to mention in passing and easily replicable is we have something called a Good Human Campaign. And it is an opportunity, it's run through our student affairs folks, and it's an opportunity to identify and say thank you and connect with folks. And we have stickers and a website, and you can acknowledge people publicly for the great things that they do in our community. It's kind of community building, but not to underestimate, when you have like 10 or 20 of these little things that could really make a difference in a community. The second flavor, I think, is actually some pretty serious stuff that we need to do at universities. It's curricular. And so Mount Royal is a little different than a lot of institutions, but we have something called general education, which is basically a quarter of your degree. And we're doing a whole gen ed review and really looking at these issues around, how would we know, how do we, what is equity, what is inequity, what is truth, how would we know as part of a breadth requirement for everyone. And so I think that is a differentiator for us in our education. And, one of the problems, we need to make it a little bit better, because whenever I talk to current students, they always say, I hate this. And then whenever I meet alumni, they always say, the best thing you ever did for me was this thing. So, and then lastly, I would just say is standing up, being present, is a huge, in all of us, in all of our communities. Currently there are people who are very raw. There's people who are mad at us, and it's going to the meeting when they hate your guts that's really important.
And continuing to show up, because that is part of the democratic project. I would like to imagine that all of you have been compelling enough that some people that voted no might reconsider their vote in terms of universities are working to do some things to equip students.
It's not about us, it's about the environment. I'm sure.
Democratic life. But
Ian talked about the lies we tell ourselves. That's a lie I am telling myself. It's the environment.
But I have to say that these are great examples that, again, to sort of the efficacy point that I think Shlomit made in the last panel, is a reminder that more of this is needed. Much more of this is needed, but that it is happening in different ways. It is happening in quiet ways. It is possible. And I think just finally to say a big thank you to the organizers, because I do think sometimes universities and colleges get set apart from a lot of the civic institutions and conversations. And I think to your earlier point, Toni, they're part of this ecosystem. And so really great that we were able to have this conversation. And thank you all for your attention.
Thanks for the opportunity.